Groovy! Today we're going to be going back and revisiting the Mezco Toyz Earthworm Jim figure. I first had a look at this figure back in July 30th, 2012, so if you're going to do your math, that's pretty much coming up to 6 years ago. You believe I've been doing this for 6 years? Would you believe I've been doing this almost for 10 years, doing the YouTube review thing? Needless to say, I didn't measure him back then, but I'll measure him now. This figure is 6¼ inches. 6¼ inches in height. Jim comes with only 2 accessories, but those 2 accessories are pretty cool. First things first, he comes with his plasma blaster, which primarily has been cast in red plastic. There's a few little additional panel lining action happening here, and the inner area, just right where it goes boom, 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 pew, 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 has been painted in almost like an orangey, rusted orange color, with the main knob on the very end there in a very bright orange. I can report that successfully it's still held intact. Nothing has been broken on it. And actually, really, the Earthworm Jim figure as a whole is a well-constructed figure. We'll talk about that in a second, but really neat-looking blaster. You can go ahead and put it into his hand. Doesn't, however, fit in either hand. The other hand is kind of more of a grabbing, kind of, dynamic pose hand. So it really only fits in one of his hands. The other thing he comes with is his other self, and what's really neat about this Earthworm Jim, even though despite the fact that you wouldn't be able to put it into his head, the socket of his suit, this one here is the wire frame. So at the very least, you can bend and manipulate Jim's body. This is Jim, after all, in all his worm splendor. You can bend it in any way, any which way that you really want. And for that matter, too, you could technically go ahead and take the figure out of the socket area here, which is easier said than done. Takes a little bit of finagling to get it out of the socket. Here we go. And then once out of the socket, you can then go ahead and take the flexible Jim and you can put it into his hand. I suppose you could make it almost look as if he's whipping somebody like he does in the game. Jumping over him like a skipping rope probably would be a little bit more difficult, but it's pretty cool. I mean, that is neat. The only difficult end of it, though, it is tricky to get the head out of the socket. I know what you're thinking. Well, why don't you just leave it in the socket, call it a day? Well, it wouldn't really make much sense for him to be holding himself and for having his head still in the suit. So taking it out of the suit would be a lot easier. It unfortunately is the trade-off that by giving him full poseability in a ball socket, it also makes it very difficult to get the head out of the socket. So it's a bit of a trade-off, I'm afraid. Go ahead and put this back in. Kind of wiggle, 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 wiggle. Kind of helps too if you just twist it a little bit. There we go. And then pop it back into place. We'll go ahead and take, and actually, by the way, if you just wanted to see it, there are the 2 Jim heads. It would be so cool if they had it. This wouldn't have worked because you would have had very little to grab onto, but if they had a way to detach the head here, or at the very least detach this head and have a ball joint, you could have mixed and matched the heads. I suppose you could really ultimately cut this and just kind of glue it in place, but I really like this head much more anyways. Just there's the difference between the 2. Okay, we'll move that to the side. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to go back and have a look at this figure is there's yet to be a perfect Earthworm Jim figure leading up to, and then ultimately being after this release here. I think Mezco has really captured a perfect Earthworm Jim, and really about the only other Earthworm Jim figures that we've gotten have been like the Playmates from the Earthworm Jim. I've said that so many times already. The cartoon series. So like this one is kind of more the standalone. Ultimately, though, he is a little on the staction side. In other words, there's really very little that you can move to Jim. I guess we could kind of go through his poseability right now. His arms rotate all the way around. You can hinge the arms outward. And he does have a bend at the elbows, both elbows. Rotate at the arms, or the forearms, that I should say. And you can rotate the waist. That's it. And technically, that's not true. That's not 100% true. you do have the luxuries of having the additional ball joint in the head, so you can move the head really any which way you want. Kind of look as if he's gotten blasted by some heavy wind. Again, you can really do it like a lot with the head. But the reasoning why I think this figure works so incredibly well is the sculpt is, mwah, it is awesome. It is limited on poseability, granted, yes, but if you really like look and you get down to the bare basics of it, you really wouldn't want to hinge anyways on the knees, because those legs would be loose as, well, you know, loose as loose can be. Same thing could be said for the ankles. I wouldn't want to put articulation there. So really, it has everything where I would want articulation, nor would I necessarily need a crunch or anything like that. So while it may seem at face value on paper as very limited in poseability, I really do think it has everything where it would need to have poseability, and not adding anything further to it that could hinder really the figure being that much better, or hinder the figure being, you know, being posable, so to speak. So anyways, let's have a look at the head sculpt, and then we'll kind of work our way down. Earthworm Jim's head, as you can see, has a considerable grimace, his teeth showing. Very determined, very angry looking Earthworm Jim. His eyeballs are pointing, or I should say his pupils are pointing off to the side, which normally would bother me, but I think for the nature of the type of character that he is, it's not too big of a deal for me. Having him facing frontward, I really don't think would benefit, because then you can have... Normally, I would probably angle the figure sideways. That's probably how I would likely display him, which I've had this guy in storage for the longest of times. But I like the fact that he's actually looking to the side, which is so contrary to what I would normally say. If a figure is kind of looking off to the side, it limits what you could really do with him, but I think for Earthworm Jim, it actually works well, and it works in his favor. The detailing on his head is just incredible. And keeping in mind as well, this figure is about 7 years old. It's about 6 years old currently. It might have even been released a little bit prior to me reviewing it. So it's been a while that we've released or have gotten this figure in, you know, in stores, and it's pretty cool to have it in the collection. I kind of just wish though that Mezco, I don't know the reasoning why they haven't done more of these. Could just be chalked up to licensing, unfortunately. But it's a shame that we never got more Earthworm Jim figures. I mean, at the risk of saying that this is like the best Earthworm Jim, I'm actually really going to say it. It is the best Earthworm Jim figure I have seen, and I luckily was able to pick up and add to the collection. But again, it's a shame that we haven't gotten more of these. As for some little small details, what I do like is primarily he's a white suited figure, but they've gone in and they've airbrushed little accent areas, or areas to highlight around the musculature of the figure. Of course, this is more of a robotic suit that he's sporting. It's only really up here, it's his main body. But that additional blue really certainly goes a long way of adding some extra depth to the figure. Because I mean, if you really took that off, the figure's primary white body, so many of these cool little sculpts, like especially around the rib cage and around the pectoral muscles, would really ultimately get lost. They would still be there, but they wouldn't show as well, especially in the areas around the bicep and tricep area of the suit. A little airbrushing goes a long way for me. The gloves have some additional airbrushing of some more of a darker black added to it, and he's got the accent areas of the yellow, the bands around his wrists, and of course around his neck area there as well. Got himself a little backpack. You can't open it up, there's nothing inside. But again, you've got the nice little airbrushing happening there as well. Yeah, all in all, it's a great looking figure. Could it have afforded some additional posability? I think perhaps yes, but ultimately I think that would have also sacrificed the figure's longevity at the very least. Having posability necessarily in legs and stuff like that, if you remove it, you kind of have to ask yourself, well, would it benefit the figure as if it had it? Many times we've gotten figures in the past that have had really small, skinny legs, and they've also put posability in it, and you know ultimately what ends up happening. The figure gets really loose over time, and it ultimately just can't stand up. The Mezco Toyz Earthworm Jim figure is still one of my all-time favorites. It would fall within my top 10 favorite figures of all time. Makes me think, though, I really should do a top 10 video showcasing my favorite figures of all time. Maybe that will come in a future video, so stay tuned for that. Don't want to get ahead of ourselves though. Speaking solely to the Mezco Toyz Earthworm Jim, like I said, it is a well-rounded, well-sculpted, well-painted figure. Could it have had some additional poseability? Again, maybe. But I think I would much rather have a staction figure, at least from the waist down, that has little to no poseability and still have a figure that I could stand up well 6 years later. I mean, if you look at the joints and if you look at what little poseability it has, this figure will look like this 10 years from now, 15 years from now, and it will never get loose. This is my one argument towards anybody that would say, well, a figure is limited in articulation. It's really weak sauce that they didn't put more poseability in the figure. But if you really look at the waist down, any bit of hinging and stuff that you would have added to the knees and the ankles would ultimately mean that this figure right now would be all over the place and it wouldn't be able to stand up. In this case, and this case alone, I would take staction, non-posable limbs over something that is superposable. The trade-off for this is the fact that you have the interchangeable heads. Earthworm Jim's one worm body, as you can see, can be extended out, so you can kind of have that makeshift look like he's whipping somebody with his head. I do like the options of you can swap the two heads out, and of course the included blaster is also a really nice touch. He's painted well. I mean, he's not the most heavily colored figure anyways, primarily looking at solely whites and a little bit of blues. But I think all of those whites and blues are still handled well from the folks over at Mezco Toyz. If you're lucky enough to find this one, and unfortunately with the prices being as they are, finding him in aftermarket can be a little on the expensive side, but if you can find him for a good price, I would highly recommend getting this one and adding it to your collection, especially much like if you're like me and you grew up playing the Earthworm Jim series. This is definitely the true iconic look of Earthworm Jim that I've been waiting to get in plastic form, and Mezco Toyz delivered it. They delivered it about 7 years ago, but still, they delivered it. Today, though, we were having a look and going back and revisiting the Mezco Toyz Earthworm Jim action figure. Not so much more in the way of action, but still a pretty cool figure nonetheless. If you guys want to go back and have a look at some of the other throwbacks that I've done on this channel, basically meaning any videos that I've done a second double dipping for, kind of going back and revisiting those figures, those are throwbacks. There's a throwback channel playlist that you'll be able to find and have a look at everything that I've covered once again on this specific channel. Speaking of throwbacks too, let me know if there's any figures that you would like to see me revisit, maybe in future videos. And make sure you also hit that little subscribe button so it'll guarantee you that when new videos are coming onto this channel, you'll never miss out. As always, guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.